When Sheila told me that Sunday afternoon that I should sell my Volvo to help her mother buy a house, I didn't have a breakdown. I didn't even raise my voice. I just went very, very quiet. That car was the last project my husband and I worked on together before he passed away. And when Leo didn't even look up from his coffee, I realized something I didn't need to scream. I just needed to stop letting everyone treat me like I was a convenience store that never closed. I set my dessert fork down on the plate, very softly. And later that evening, I took the car keys off the hook. My daughter-in-law had the nerve to suggest I sell my favorite car to fund her mother's real estate dreams. It was the wake-up call I didn't know I needed. She actually smirked and said, "It's just a car, Diane." I felt a cold wave of disappointment wash over me. This happened on a perfectly ordinary Sunday over coffee in my living room. My husband has been gone for 5 years, and that car, a classic mint-condition Volvo, was our pride and joy. It wasn't just a hunk of metal. It was a piece of my life. My son Leo sat there like a statue, staring into his mug. He kept stirring his coffee as if he could somehow dissolve the awkwardness of the moment. Sheila sat up straight, acting like she'd just made a comment about the weather. She was dead serious about me trading my memories for her mother's comfort. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just placed my fork down. "My car isn't for sale," I said evenly. Sheila rolled her eyes. "You barely drive long distances anymore, and my mom really needs a place of her own. We could use that cash as a down payment. Besides, you're living in this big house all by yourself. It's a bit much for one person, don't you think?" I looked at Leo. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when it clicked. This wasn't some random thought. They had discussed this. My own son was perfectly fine with dismantling my life bit by bit. I didn't bother defending myself. There's no point in an argument when the other side has zero respect for you. I stood up, gathered the empty plates, and walked to the kitchen. On my way past the hallway, I grabbed the car keys from the hook. I tucked them deep into my pocket. It was a small move, but it felt like laying the first heavy brick in a very necessary wall. From the kitchen, I heard Sheila complaining to Leo about how stubborn I was being. I flipped off the coffee maker and closed my eyes for a second. My mind was made up. Things in this house were about to change radically. The next morning, I noticed the first little territory marking that I usually would have ignored. Sheila had rearranged the kitchen. My favorite mugs were shoved into the back of a high cabinet while her expensive smoothie makers were front and center on the counter. It was her way of saying she ran the place. Usually, I would have just sighed and adapted to keep the peace. Not today. I didn't make a scene. I just moved my coffee maker and my mugs right back where they belonged. I tucked the smoothie maker into the pantry. Then I went into the hall. Leo and Sheila lived in the upstairs suite rent-free, but they treated the whole house like their personal playground. My home office, filled with my books and files, was always open. I went in, gathered my most important papers, and pulled the door shut behind me. I turned the key in the lock. That little click was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in years. An hour later, Sheila came downstairs. I heard her rattling the doorknob to the office. "Why is this locked?" she shouted. I was sitting at the dining table, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the paper. "Because it's my private space," I replied without looking up. She marched into the kitchen, looking offended. "But the printer is in there. I have to print something for work." I turned the page. "Then I guess you two should buy your own printer for upstairs. My office stays locked from now on." She opened her mouth, closed it, and stomped back upstairs. Leo came down a bit later, looking sheepish. He didn't mention the printer. I knew they expected me to cave because I always had. They knew me as the easygoing mom who hated conflict. They were about to find out that my patience had hit a hard limit. Wednesday was traditionally the night Sheila and Leo went out. For months, it had been a given that I'd cook dinner and clean up after them before they headed out. They never asked. They just expected it. That afternoon, I put on a nice blouse, grabbed my purse, and took my umbrella. Around 4 p.m., Sheila came down fully made up. "The chicken is in the fridge," she said as she walked past. "We're leaving at 6:30, so it'd be great if dinner was ready by 6. I put on my coat and looked at her calmly. "Then you'd better start cooking now." "I have plans." She stopped dead. "What? You can't go out now. We have a reservation." "Who's making dinner?" I checked my reflection in the mirror, adjusting my scarf. "You're both adults. I'm sure you won't starve. Have a nice night." I walked out the front door into the crisp air, leaving a stunned silence behind me. I didn't actually have a big event. I just went to a little cafe down the street, ordered a slice of apple pie, and read a book. It wasn't about the appointment. It was about the fact that they felt entitled to my time. I stayed there for 3 hours. My phone buzzed twice. It was Leo. I let it ring. When I finally got home, the house was dark. There was an empty pizza box in the sink. I smiled to myself, put the box in the recycling, and went to bed. No fighting, no drama, just a clear boundary. I had officially withdrawn the maid service they thought was their birthright. The next morning at breakfast, the atmosphere was freezing. Nobody spoke a word to me. I didn't care. I actually enjoyed my coffee more than usual. After breakfast, I sat down with my laptop. I decided it was time for a forensic audit of my own life. 2 years ago, I'd given Leo a joint card on my account. He was switching jobs at the time, and I wanted to make sure they could cover groceries if things got tight. Emergency use had turned into a lifestyle. I scrolled through the statements. Grocery hauls, gas station fill-ups, even high-end skincare from Sephora. All of it coming out of my pocket. They both had good jobs, but they were padding their savings while using my account as their personal slush fund. I felt a sting of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by cold, hard resolve. I grabbed my keys and drove to the bank. My banker, Mr. Henderson, has known me for years. "Diane, what can I do for you today?" he asked. "I'd like to remove Leo Miller from my account and cancel his card immediately," I said. "Also, I'd like to stop the automatic payments for the utility bills. I won't be covering the electricity and water for the second floor anymore." He tapped away at his keyboard. Done and done. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store. I bought exactly what I needed for myself. No organic juices for Sheila. No specific snacks for Leo. When I put them in the fridge, I mentally marked my shelf as mine. The financial umbilical cord was cut. I knew the explosion was coming the next time they were at a checkout counter, but I wasn't afraid. I was done being the invisible ATM. It happened Friday afternoon. I was in the living room knitting when the front door swung open. Sheila stormed in, her face flushed with anger. Leo trailed behind her, looking at the floor. "Your card didn't work," Sheila yelled, tossing the plastic card onto the coffee table. "I was at the store with a full cart, and I was totally embarrassed. The cashier said it was declined." I put my knitting down and looked at her. "That's because I canceled it yesterday morning." Sheila stared at me like I'd slapped her. "Why would you do that without warning us? We need that card for the house." I leaned back. "You needed that card when Leo was between jobs. Now you both make plenty of money. It's my money, and I've decided I'm done paying for your gas and your skincare. The household you were funding was yours, not mine." Leo cleared his throat. Mom, you could have at least said something. It was really awkward for Sheila. I looked directly at my son. What's awkward, Leo, is being taken advantage of by your own kids. You live here rent-free. You pay 0 utilities. Using my bank card on top of that is over. I'm not subsidizing your lives anymore. Sheila crossed her arms. You're being incredibly selfish. You're sitting on all this money and this huge house while we're trying to build a future. I stayed completely relaxed. My husband and I worked for 40 years to build this. You're adults. Build your own. I picked my knitting back up. This conversation is over. They stood there for a moment, helpless. My lack of drama gave them nothing to fight against. Eventually, Sheila turned and stomped upstairs, and Leo followed. I just kept knitting. The first real boundary had been defended, and I felt lighter than I had in years. 2 weeks went by in a cold, silent stalemate. Then Sheila's mother, Mrs. Gable, came for the weekend. She was a loud, pushy woman who always acted like she owned the place. The second she sat down in my living room, she started critiquing the furniture. These sofas are so dated, she remarked. When Sheila and Leo take over the downstairs, we should go with something lighter. It'll open up the room. I sat in my armchair sipping tea, just watching. Nobody had asked me about them taking over anything. It was clear they were already dividing up my estate while I was still sitting in it. Sheila brought her mother coffee, beaming. Yeah, we were thinking it's time for a total renovation once we restructure things. I didn't say a word. I just observed. Later that afternoon, I looked out the kitchen window. Mrs. Gable was in the driveway, with Sheila pacing out the space next to my Volvo. A carport would fit perfectly right here for my car, she shouted. They were treating my home like a fixer-upper, and I was just the tenant they were waiting to evict. Instead of losing my temper, I went into my locked office. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. I'd seen enough. The silent expectation that I'd eventually disappear into the basement guest room was over. I didn't need a lawyer to protect my home. I just needed a plan. I sat down and wrote out a very practical, very firm document. They wanted to act like homeowners then. They were going to learn what it was like to be real tenants. Monday morning was a holiday, and Sheila had been loud about their plans for a weekend getaway to the mountains. I knew what that meant. They planned on taking my Volvo because it was more comfortable for a long drive than their little hatchback. In the past, they'd just grab the keys and go. Tuesday morning, I woke up at 6 a.m. The house was silent. I packed a small bag, dressed comfortably, and went to the kitchen. I made a travel mug of coffee, grabbed my keys from my purse, and checked my phone. I'd booked a quiet hotel on the coast. It was time for a break. I walked out into the cool morning air, climbed into my Volvo, and backed out of the driveway. I didn't leave a note. Around 9 a.m., my phone started ringing. Leo. I let it ring as I cruised down the highway. 10 minutes later, a text. Mom, where are you? Where's the car? We were supposed to leave for the mountains today. I pulled into a rest area and typed a short reply. I'm away for a few days. I needed my car. Enjoy your weekend. I turned my phone on silent and shoved it in the glove box. I could picture the chaos. Sheila staring at her packed suitcases, Leo looking useless. They hadn't asked permission. They had just assumed my property was theirs. This trip wasn't just a vacation. It was a declaration of independence. I spent 3 beautiful days by the ocean, walking the beach and reading. I was recharging for the final step. When I pulled back into my driveway on Friday afternoon, I could feel the tension radiating from the house. Leo's car was parked crookedly out front. I grabbed my bag and walked inside. They were waiting in the living room. Sheila jumped up the second she saw me. "Where have you been?" she snapped. "We had to cancel our entire trip because you just disappeared with the car." That was incredibly immature and selfish. I set my bag down and took off my coat, hanging it up slowly. I didn't even look at her. "It's my car, Sheila. I don't need to ask for permission to use it." Leo stood up too. "Mom, come on. It's the principal. We were counting on it." I nodded slowly. "I know you were. You count on a lot of things. Which is why I brought you something." I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd prepared. I set it on the coffee table in front of Leo. "What's this?" he asked, suspicious. "It's a standard lease agreement," I explained calmly. "For the upstairs suite. It includes a flat rate for your portion of the utilities. The rent is fair based on what apartments go for in this neighborhood. It starts on the 1st of next month." Sheila stared at the envelope like it was a bomb. "You're charging your own son rent? Are you serious?" "I'm finally being serious," I said softly. "You're two adults with great incomes. If you want to live in this house and treat it like you own it, you're going to pay for it. If you don't want to sign, that's fine. You'll have until the end of next month to find a new place." I picked up my bag and headed upstairs to my room, leaving them alone with the new reality. The next few days were filled with angry whispering in the halls and doors slamming upstairs. They thought I was bluffing. They thought I'd fold the moment they threatened to leave. On Wednesday night, Leo came into the kitchen alone. He had the unsigned lease in his hand. "Mom, we're not paying this. It's ridiculous. Sheila won't do it. We're moving out." He said it with a defiant tone, waiting for me to gasp and apologize. I took a sip of water, looked him in the eye, and nodded. "That's your choice. Please make sure the upstairs is clean and hand over the keys by the end of the month." Leo's jaw actually dropped. He hadn't expected me to accept his bluff. He stood there for a second, put the lease on the table, and walked out without another word. For the next 2 weeks, the house was a construction zone of packing tape and boxes. Sheila walked around with a look of practiced suffering, carrying crates to the car. I didn't help, but I didn't get in the way either. I just lived my life. On the last Saturday of the month, a U-Haul pulled up. When the truck was loaded, Leo came to find me. He laid 2 sets of keys on the patio table. He looked tired and, surprisingly, a little sad. "Here are the keys," he said quietly. "We're out." "Take care of yourself, Leo," I said. I didn't hug him, but I wasn't cold. He nodded, climbed into Sheila's car, and they drove away. I watched until they turned the corner. Then I picked up the keys, put them in my pocket, and took a deep, clean breath. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't a lonely quiet. It was the peaceful atmosphere of a place that finally belonged to me again. The next morning, I went upstairs. The rooms were empty and smelled like dust. I opened all the windows wide, letting the fresh air scrub the rooms clean. I decided to turn their old bedroom into a bright guest room for my friends, and the other room would be my new craft space. Nobody was going to move my mugs anymore. Nobody was going to treat my bank account like a free-for-all. I didn't need a lawyer or a huge blowout. I just stopped being the doormat they walked on. 6 months later, Leo came over on a Sunday afternoon. He came alone. Sheila still refused to step foot in the house. He brought a cake, and we sat on the patio. He told me that life in their new expensive apartment was stressful and that they were both working more hours to keep up with the bills. He looked exhausted. I listened without saying, "I told you so." I didn't offer him money either. I just refilled his coffee and we talked about the garden. When he left, he looked over at my old Volvo, freshly washed and gleaming in the driveway. She looks good, Mom, he said softly. Yes, she does, I replied, smiling. And she still runs like a dream. I stood in the doorway and waved as he drove off. Then I went inside, closed the door, and turned the deadbolt. I wasn't a martyr, and I wasn't a villain. I was just a woman who had reclaimed her space. And that felt better than any victory I could have imagined.